So I'm going to teach you how to do the research methodology chapter in a thesis or paper, and this will save you a ton of time. So what I want you to do is to think about the research methodology in terms of a story. That's what we do. We tell a narrative. We tell a scientific narrative within the research methodology section. And there's generally a couple of parts to this narrative. So the first thing that you need to do with the research methodology section is to write the setting and describe the setting. What are you actually going to talk about? And it has to relate to both your dependent variable and your independent variable in terms of what you're explaining and why it's actually important. You go into very much the overview of what you're going to talk about. Then after that, what you talk about is your sample, right? You get into what is the actual population, what is the actual data that you gathered. That's basically your first paragraph, is the data that you gathered. And then the second paragraph of that section, or maybe it's the page or a couple of pages if you're writing a dissertation, is how you actually narrowed down and picked a sample based on that particular data. Now, the tricky part is if you're writing this for a research paper, is thinking about what you're going to illustrate and what you are actually going to talk about. So the goal is to tell a story. So sometimes you emphasize different aspects. So it's not necessarily talking about everything that you actually did, because there's a lot of stuff that you typically do, but it is going into the details that are relevant, that could be people can replicate, and that actually is telling a story and what you actually did. So those are the two big areas that you'd want to get into. Then after that, there is a third section that is becoming increasingly more important in most research, especially in the last few years, is the identification section, where you go in and you talk about how are you going to identify the effect of what you're looking at. So that's the key thing, right? Is thinking about how is it that you're actually going to find the effect. And that's where you get into the research designs and various different research designs that you can look at. And there's a whole great big literature on this in terms of the research designs, whether it being a quasi-experiment or an experiment or qualitative data or whatever, where you're going in and talking about how you're actually identifying the thing that you're trying to do. And that's really what you're looking at with causal identification, is looking at how are we going to actually know this thing exists if we actually look at it. It's not just about statistical significance, but it's ruling out all of the other possible threats to validity, all those other things that could ruin the study. Or somebody can say, hey, did you think about this? And you're like, dang it, I should have thought about this. So it's really going into a lot of detail, and that's where a lot of clever work is being done at this moment, where people are trying to identify the effect, where you're thinking very cleverly and very sneakily to think about different ways that you can isolate the particular effect that you're looking at. So that is the key part of the research methodology section. And then after that, you get into describing whether it's your variables and measurements. I can never say the word operationalizations of what you're looking at, but it's really just talking about the measurements of what you actually looked at if you're doing quantitative stuff. So that is the key thing. So thinking about the research setting. So especially if you're doing qualitative work, you really get into that research setting and you're telling that story and what you're trying to do. But even quantitative work, you should really talk about that research setting. And it's becoming more and more important. People are recognizing that this is really, really important to talk about. Whether you're doing, a study on fisheries versus, fishery departments, for example, versus doing it on Wall Street, those are really different contexts, and those often really matter to the results that you're actually going to get. And if we don't acknowledge them, I think that's really silly, because you're missing out on a lot of nuance that's going on. So you have to acknowledge where you actually gathered the stuff and where it actually makes sense of what you're looking at. And then, gathering that data, whether it is, the data that you actually find, the archival data, for example, sometimes you have to clean what is called clean data, because data is not clean when you see it. It's really messy, right? If you've actually reached and gathered and gone into data, you'll realize it's really, really messy. This is a critical part that I think is missing in almost all research today, that I think needs to be emphasized a little bit more, is how do you clean this data? And especially if you're doing a thesis or a dissertation, going through and talking about all the different, exceptions and those kind of things that come up is going to be really, really important for you to describe that, particularly in your thesis and dissertation, because that's the goal of it, is to be really rich. And then after that, getting into, how you actually sampled this data, what it is that how you selected the data that you got to, and all of those assumptions lead to the results that you actually get. And then finally, sort of thinking about the identification strategy and looking at the research methods to isolate the effect that you actually have something that leads to this, and there's no possible explanation of why that might be a different scenario. Now, we know that is not true. There's always threats to validity in terms of understanding this thing, but you're trying to discuss and show that you did everything possible to isolate that. So hopefully this helps you out in terms of research methodology. There's a lot that goes on to it, but remember, you're telling a story. The whole paper, the whole research is about a narrative where you're actually telling a story and getting into it. So, by the way, if you haven't done so, give me a thumbs up, do subscribe to the YouTube channel, and check out the reciprocity platform. The E is written with a 3. I'm trying to build this out so we, as researchers, as people that write for a living, that we can have a tool that just makes work easier. So constantly building this stuff out, building more and more features into that every day. So go check that out. It's all about making our job easier and making it a lot more fun. All right, take care and have a wonderful day. Bye.